Imagine a man who could disarm the finest swordsman in Europe before breakfast and conduct a masterpiece symphony for a queen by dinner. A man who was the champion of the fencing hall, the virtuoso of the concert stage, and a colonel on the blood-soaked battlefields of the French Revolution.
This was Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. He was a man who reached the absolute pinnacle of human achievement in two completely unrelated fields, all while fighting a society determined to keep him in the shadows because of the color of his skin.
This is the story of the most talented man of the 18th century, the Black Mozart, though in truth, history should remember Mozart as the White St. George's.
To understand the legend, we have to travel back to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe in 1745. Joseph was born into a world of brutal contradictions. His father, Georges de Bologne Saint-Georges, was a wealthy white plantation owner. His mother, Nanon, was a beautiful African woman held in slavery.
Under the laws of the time, Joseph was born illegitimate and of low status. Yet his father did something unconventional. He recognized Joseph as his son and took him, along with Nanon, back to France. Arriving in Paris at the age of 7, Joseph was thrust into the heart of the Enlightenment. But Paris was a city of rigid hierarchies. As a person of color, Joseph faced a ceiling that was supposed to be unbreakable. His father, however, gave him the finest education money could buy. At age 13, Joseph was enrolled in the elite fencing academy of Nicolas Texier de la Boissière. This wasn't just a sports club, it was a finishing school for the aristocracy, where the art of the sword was considered the ultimate expression of a gentleman's character.
Young Joseph didn't just participate, he dominated. He possessed an uncanny combination of speed, reach, and psychological intuition. He practiced for hours every day, honing his reflexes until they were supernatural.
By the time he was 17, he was challenging and defeating the most seasoned masters in France. One famous master, Giuseppe Gianfoldoni, boasted that he would easily dispatch the upstart. Instead, Joseph beat him so decisively that Gianfoldoni declared Joseph the greatest fencer in the world. It was during these years that he was appointed a member of the king's bodyguard and earned the title he would carry forever, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. But while his blade was winning him fame in the fencing halls, his hands were busy with another instrument. Parallel to his athletic training, Joseph was mastering the violin. He studied under the great Jean-Marie Leclerc and François-Joseph Gossec. His talent was so profound that it seemed impossible. He wasn't just playing existing music, he was redefining what the violin could do. His compositions were marked by extreme technical difficulty, featuring high-speed passages and lyrical melodies that demanded a level of dexterity few could match. By the late 1760s, he had joined the Concert des Amateurs, one of the finest orchestras in Europe. He started as a violinist, but within a few years, he was its director. Under his leadership, the orchestra became the envy of the continent. It was during this period that St. Georges reached the height of his musical influence. He pioneered the symphonie concertante, a new musical form that combined the power of a symphony with the individual brilliance of a concerto.
When Joseph walked onto a stage, he was a superstar. He was tall, athletic, handsome, and impeccably dressed. The Parisian elite, including Queen Marie Antoinette herself, were enchanted. However, the higher he rose, the more the ugliness of the era's racism clawed at him. In 1776, a vacancy opened for the position of director of the Paris Opera. It was the most prestigious musical post in France. St. George was the obvious choice.
But 3 of the opera's leading ladies petitioned the queen, stating they would never submit to the orders of a mulatto. Rather than face the scandal, King Louis XVI simply left the position vacant. It was a crushing blow, but St. George didn't retreat. He pivoted. If he couldn't run the opera, he would compose his own. He wrote several successful operas and continued to lead the most prestigious orchestras in Paris.
It was also around this time that he crossed paths with a young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was staying in the same house as St. George for several months. Many historians believe that Mozart, who was struggling at the time, was deeply jealous of the older, more successful St. George.
You can hear echoes of St. George's style in Mozart's later works, particularly his violin concertos. The man history ignored was the man the masters were actually listening to. As the 1780s drew to a close, the air in France began to smell of revolution. The Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity resonated deeply with a man who had spent his life being treated as an equal in skill, but an inferior in law. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Saint-Georges didn't hesitate. He traded his conductor's baton for a cavalry saber. He joined the National Guard and was soon tasked with a historic mission, forming the first all-black military unit in European history. This was the 13th Light Cavalry Regiment, famously known as the Légion Saint-Georges. He recruited men of African descent from across France and the colonies, training them with the same discipline he had applied to his music and his fencing. The Chevalier proved to be a brilliant military leader. In 1792, during the Siege of Lille, St. George and his men were instrumental in repelling the Austrian forces. He was a war hero, a man who led from the front, often charging into the thick of battle. But the revolution was a fickle beast. As the reign of terror took hold, no one was safe, especially not a man who had once been a favorite of the Queen and the aristocracy. Despite his service to the Republic, St. George was caught in the paranoia of the time. He was accused of using public funds for his regiment and, more dangerously, of harboring aristocratic leanings. He was stripped of his command and thrown into prison. For 18 months, the greatest virtuoso in Europe sat in a damp cell, facing the very real possibility of the guillotine. He was eventually released after the fall of Robespierre, but the world he returned to was unrecognizable. His regiment had been disbanded, his musical career was in tatters.
The radical equality promised by the revolution was being rolled back. He traveled to Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, to join the slave revolts there, but found himself disillusioned by the extreme violence.
He returned to Paris in his final years, a shadow of his former self, but still possessing a spark of his old fire. He tried to rebuild his orchestra, the Cercle de l'Harmonie, and continued to play the violin with a grace that left audiences in tears. But his health was failing. He died in 1799 at the age of 54 from a combination of bladder infection and exhaustion. The tragedy of the Chevalier de Saint-Georges didn't end with his death. Shortly after he passed, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. Napoleon, in one of his most regressive acts, reinstated slavery in the French colonies and banned people of color from the military. In an effort to erase the contributions of non-white citizens, St. George's music was banned from performance. His scores were removed from libraries, and his name was scrubbed from the history of French music. For nearly 2 centuries, one of the greatest geniuses of the Enlightenment was effectively deleted from human memory. But brilliance cannot be buried forever. In the late 20th century, musicologists began to rediscover his scores. They found music that was vibrant, complex, and revolutionary. They found records of a fencer who had never lost a major duel. They found the story of a soldier who led his people with honor.
Joseph Bologne was a man who lived 1,000 lives. He was a reminder that excellence is the greatest form of rebellion. He fought for his dignity with a sword, he fought for his soul with a violin, and he fought for his country with a regiment.
He was a master of harmony and a master of war. Today, as his music once again fills the great concert halls of the world, we finally recognize the Chevalier de Saint-Georges not as an imitation of anyone else, but as a singular, unrepeatable force of nature. If you want to discover more hidden figures who changed the course of history, subscribe now.